After some thought, I've decided not to really drop the controversy box around this one. I could. This is definitely a controversial issue, especially right now in modern history. But this is also an issue that's been controversial for centuries, if not longer. I'm speaking, of course, of the concept of refugees. And I want to hit that right off the bat and hit the ground running. Let's go ahead and summarize the situation really quick. The refugees concept has no best answer. There's no win-win for all involved kind of a thing. It doesn't work that way. There are ways to try and deal with the many complexities and difficulties of the refugee situation, but ultimately it all just kind of boils down to it sucking. So we have the Narn refugees. Notice there's not really a lot of Centauri refugees, which again helps to emphasize the fact that the Narn are in fact losing the war. So lots and lots and lots of Narn refugees. What do you do with them? There are so many they are quite literally overwhelming the medical and indeed basic space capacities of Babylon 5. Do you deny them entry since you can't help anymore? Do you try to get them, do you try to ship them home where they can become refugees again when that particular new home gets conquered? Do you send them back to the homeworld and let them be the enemy's government, or the Narn's government's problem? There are several answers there. None of them really good. Just ways of dealing with a bad situation. But the one that really sticks with me is the one they mention right at the end, the really sticking issue. Obviously, triage is a very important thing when dealing with this kind of a crisis situation. For those of you who are not fully familiar with the idea, triage as a concept is basically identify who needs the aid the most and prioritize based on that. It's a very simple concept, and it's probably, I'd say, the most basic and yet the nevertheless most important fundamental aspect of medical care. So, some people call it triage. I've heard it said several different ways. But then they ask, what about the dying? That's a really tricky situation, in my opinion. It's funny because the dying situation when it comes to triage is without question the moment at which there is no in-between. There is only the absolute cold calculus and the absolute sentimental, emotional reaction. And the two are at complete odds with each other. The harsh, cold calculus says, these people are going to die. There's nothing we can do about that. They are the dying. Ergo, in a triage situation, you dump them out. Leave them on the cold floors to be gathered later as corpses. There is no reason to waste time, effort, resources, or basically anything on them other than to make sure that their corpses do not end up someplace where they're going to be infecting the living. You could basically dump them in a dumpster or shoot them in the head to speed their passing, for all you care, right? The sentimental side of things, well, Sheridan says it best himself, doesn't he? I'm not going to let these people die alone and in pain on the cold metal floor. Does anybody deserve to die that way? The sentimental side of us would say that's inhuman, that's abhorrent, to just shove those people aside. And so we will waste time and resources trying to ensure that their passing is at the very least comfortable. I don't have a better word than that. Trying to ease their passing, I guess, is the best way to put that. I am not saying either of these perspectives are correct, by the way, only pointing out how they are so diverse and so, not diverse, divergent, how they have no possible connection one with another. I'm going to go ahead and say another thing. I'm just going to move on from that topic. So obviously we find out that's going on. This is a big Revelations episode. We find out that the war between the Narn and the Centauri is going very badly for the Narn. We find out some big secrets, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. I no longer have to add spoilers around certain things. And we learn about what's going on home. There's 3 big reveals in this. Well, 3 reveals, 2 of which are big in this one. We finally have a name for the first time. Now, this is something I've been wanting to talk about up until this episode. I knew this was coming. This is the first time ever. This episode right here is when the shadows as a species are name dropped. It's the first time we ever have that term referring to them. Now, if you don't understand the significance of that, if you really go back and reanalyze the show, based on the way things were presented, the term shadows never was really being used as in the capital S prior to now. They were referring to things that could be implied to be referring to the capital S shadows. But otherwise, every time they would use the term shadows with regards to these things, it would mean in the more literal sense of, dark things hide in the shadows. I'm sorry, not literal. Non-literal, the metaphorical side of things. This is the first time we know that, yes, these things are called the shadows. Now, I point that out because I have actually tried very hard to avoid referring to these things as the shadows, this entire rumination thus far, in the vain hope of preserving that sort of reveal for anybody, and so that people can look back and be like, for anybody who is watching this show for the first time. I'm talking about you, Samurai. But I know several of the rest of you have as well. I'm sure most of you picked up on that, and it's a damn shame in my opinion, because while it's not exactly what I would call a twist, it is interesting to see that this. Again, when I first watched this show, I was assuming they meant shadows fully in the metaphorical sense up to this point in time. Finding out that the actual enemy that we've been preparing for and seeing hints of this entire time is actually referred to as the shadows was therefore kind of a moment for me. Not a big reveal, but nevertheless having impact. And so I've been trying to preserve that on the show. So if anybody is wondering why occasionally I delete a certain comment which doesn't really look spoilery, it's because you referred to the capital S shadows in it, and I've been trying to preserve them. Now, this is also probably, in relation to the shadow thing, this is probably the most effective teaser I've ever actually seen on Babylon 5. God attack. Most of the time, as I've made the point, I feel the show was made regardless of teasers, and then they just kind of artificially did a cutoff point. In this episode, however, they make it really, really clear that, you see a clear, distinct picture of Mr. Morden. We, as the viewers at this point, already know Mr. Morden is bad news, and we've known that for some time. And then seeing that he was on the freaking Icarus, a lost ship, which also happened to include Sheridan's wife, yeah, that actually was a very effective teaser, and does definitely set the tone for the entire episode, which is the other thing a teaser should do. It should grab your attention and set the tone for the episode. I've talked about this many times in my Voyager videos. And this is definitely an episode of Revelations. They could have actually called this Revelations, and it would have worked. Although I hate that subtitle because it's overused to hell and back. No, one interesting thing about Morden, I want to comment really quick. You notice how Morden actually tells a lot of things that were clearly practiced and probably are true? Obviously, not all of it is true because of the things we learn in this episode, but he does mention several things that are inches from truth, just inches away, and it probably would endure most scrutiny, and in fact, I bet certain records could be falsified to ensure that it did, in fact, endure scrutiny if need be. It's also funny, given the oh my god, the connections he obviously has. I mean, God's sakes, it's really sad. Veer shows up, absolutely despises the man, and, it's like, we need to have him released. The Londo, main chief ambassador for the Centauri, which I remind you are at a very strong position at this point in time politically, and Londo himself, who's at a very strong position politically, personally extending ambassadorial rights to this gentleman. That by itself says the kind of political affluence Mr. Morden has the capacity to draw upon. Never mind the obvious fact that he can draw upon things that we now know about, and we can pretty much officially say that the Shadows are probably helping the Centauri with the war, given what Mr. Morden says at the beginning of the episode. There's an interesting line later. And by later, I mean earlier, where Franklin goes to Miss Ivanova and says, "Do you believe in God?" Now, that's an interesting question, because if you really analyze that question, it's been asked many times in real life, if you really analyze that question, it doesn't mean anything. The direct, literal answer to that question conveys almost no information whatsoever. The idea of believing in some kind of divine being is like the most basic bare line, entry-level degree of information regarding someone's beliefs and someone's belief systems. There's such a huge, gargantuan gamut of variety with regards to what individual people believe and think and feel and all that fun stuff, that the idea of simply locking it down to a simple question is almost ludicrous. Now, obviously, Mr. Franklin was going in a particular direction with that, as he was trying to discuss, where what he thinks, what he believes, and he actually does discuss what he believes. And yet, the funny thing is, despite the vacuous nature of that question, we do learn something about Ivanova through that. First, her initial answer is very typical of Ivanova. She has this tendency to answer questions in a way that doesn't answer them. You ask her A, what is your A? And her response is to give you information, but not actually to answer, this is my A. This is another excellent example of that. I was raised Jewish, went to temple, bar mitzvah, all of that stuff. But at no point does she actually answer the question until he notices that she's bypassing it. And I find that interesting that he would be able to call her on that. Especially since most people Miss Ivanova has done that throughout the course of the show up to this point in time. She's done that kind of bypassing a question by answering it without answering it. Very, very few people actually call her on it, and this is one of the few exceptions. So he calls her on it, and then she just answers flat out honestly. And I like her answer too, most of the time. It's a nice touch. By the way, while it obviously has significant parallels to this episode and is a very impacting and powerful story, I have decided after some thought not to comment on the historical accuracy or lack thereof with the Coventry story. For the sake of the episode, I'm willing to at least let it slide and not even comment on it other than this. And the only reason I even bring this up is I would be extremely surprised if some of my viewers do not say, hey, why didn't you comment on the Coventry thing? I'm not commenting on it. That's my comment. It does certainly add some impact to the story in particular, though. Sheridan, it's easy to see where he's coming from in this episode. He says it flat out in this episode, but we've seen in his portrayal thus far that there's really only the two things he cares about. He cares about his job and he cares about his people, but that obviously translates to him caring about his wife. He lost his wife, so he delved into his work. This is something his sister flat out called him out on. We've been together for 5 hours. All you've been talking about is your job. I actually do that myself in real life, too. I have to restrain myself from just babbling about my work constantly to everyone around me. Because it's about all I have to talk about. This is my life, after all. So I get where he's coming from on this one. Losing the other big thing in your life is hard to describe. So suddenly being offered this chance to get back to it is something I understand fully well. The idea of, at the very least, having understanding, of closure. And the episode goes out of its way many times to show... it could just say, obviously, Sheridan's obsessed. But let me make this statement clear. Too often, that term is used casually. Oh, you're obsessed with blah, blah, blah. I think in this case, it's probably one of the few cases you could say it's applied literally. And they go out of their way to show that several times. My favorite example is when Sheridan is being given the greater secrets of the universe. And we, the viewers, are learning incredible world-building things about the first ones and the shadows and the old war and some more pieces and foreshadowing and all sorts of great, amazing storytelling. And his response is, Anna. All he can think about is Anna and how she might still be alive. Think about that for a moment. In fact, he is so fixated on the idea that he can't even acknowledge that what she said was, those who did not serve die. Think about that. So either she chose to serve, or she's dead. Now, obviously, Mr. Morden chose to serve. And we now know that Mr. Morden's associates are the freaking shadows, the big bad guys of the setting. So, yeah. His fixation is well demonstrated. The way he interacts with Garibaldi, the way he interacts with Ivanova. He tells Ivanova flat out, if you were in my position, could you say no to this? And I understand that feeling, not just in regards to losing something. I want you to imagine there's something you care about a lot. It doesn't necessarily have to be something you want, but it is something that matters significantly to you. Now I want you to imagine that you're right there, metaphysically, metaphorically. You're inches. You can see it. Your fingers can almost graze whatever it is. You're right there. And if you could just reach just a little bit longer, you would have it, and it would be yours, and you would finally know the satisfaction and the relief of having finally accomplished whatever it is you're after. Think about that for a moment. Think about how that feels. I actually would not be surprised to know that several, if not all of my viewers, understand that feeling to some extent or another. That's where Sheridan is right here. Closure is a weird word, because some people, I think, don't really know what that means. Closure means a complete circuit in the way I like to describe it. It doesn't necessarily mean making things better. It means a closed circuit. All the pathways are locked off and everything is looped back and is completed. He had no corpse of his wife, no news of her death or her living, no information whatsoever. Being offered that closure, being offered that horrifyingly terrible just fragment of hope that she might be alive, that he might be able to see her again, has got to be one of the worst tortures. And it's so logical that he would go so far in order to accomplish it. It's interesting to me that people just come after him over and over and over for this one. But the one person's comment that really seems to resonate with him most is Franklin's. Our job descriptions might not be the same, but you and I believe the same thing, that we can make a difference, that we can make things better, that we can change things. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. But the harsh reality is we have to become accustomed to the idea that we can't. But even though we have to live with that knowledge, we don't have to live with it alone. It's a good quote. Let's shift gears really quick. This episode introduces the third, I mentioned there was a third reveal. It's not a reveal so much as a layer. We've known things are going to hell for a while, in fact, back home for a while. In fact, in the previous episode, I mentioned several subtle things. Well, they've stopped being subtle. There's now an organization called the Ministry of Peace. I don't think there's any need for spoilers whatsoever. That the organization that is devoted towards ensuring the safety of our own selves within our own selves, policing its own populace by ensuring that they are constantly knowing that they are being watched by these kind of individuals, and a whole bunch of other stuff I'll talk about in a moment. I don't think it's a spoiler to say these are the frickin' bad guys. And their armbands, yeah, they hit that one a little bit on the nose, didn't they? The Ministry of Peace is terrifying for many reasons. And we'll be talking about them more as they continue to show up in the show in the future. But I really only want to put out two things that they do. If you really... I can't fully analyze the gentleman's speech without having it side by side there, so forgive me. But the speech he gives is wonderfully crafted. Huge props to whatever writer actually wrote that, because everything he says is couched in words that have connotations of passive nature, specifically utilizing word choices and sentence structures that are designed to be calming, soothing, designed to put you at ease. And yet what he's actually saying is, we need to police ourselves before we reach out to the stars. That is the bulk of the message he gives during that speech. And there's two really terrifying things about it. Terrifying thing number one is the armband. I already mentioned it. I've already alluded to this. What is the armband's purpose? We are watching you. That's its purpose. So that anytime you see someone with that thing on, you know that you are being watched by someone who is trying to ensure that you are doing whatever it is they want you to do, and however they want you to do it. And the second thing, and this is so terrifying, I wrote this one down. Peace can be broken with a gun, a word, an idea, or a thought. And the reason that's so damn terrifying is because he made absolutely certain that a Psy-Corps telepath would be present at that meeting. Even thinking against EarthGov could break peace. And we are watching you. Now, the really interesting thing to me is these two things parallel each other. The Night Watch, which is what they're referred to as. And again, they'll be in the future as well. The Night Watch and Sheridan. They are interesting. I don't want to call them mere reflections. It's more like these are inverse of each other. The Ministry of Peace is devoted towards peace at any cost, basically. You can see that already. And they're more than willing to exude fear and terror in order to police their own. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure that you are all doing exactly what we want you to. They are, in their own way, obsessed, but not on something personal, something more political. It's about maintaining power. By contrast, Sheridan is obsessed on something very personal, willing to let go of power. You get the very strong sense that Sheridan understands this could mean his career, and he doesn't care. He almost says that flat out to Ivanova. This is more important to him than his career. This is the one thing that is more important to him than his career. And he is willing to put that on the line for this. He is obsessed, fixated. And yet the striking difference of the two, and the reason these two work so well in the same episode, is the Ministry of Peace quietly, deviously, terrifyingly slides under the rug, whereas Sheridan much more brazenly and openly tries to, violate the law in order to obtain his own ends, and turns away from it. Now, I've actually heard some people speak against this, but I like the fact that Sheridan did not turn away from his obsession in this episode. Why? Because that's not necessary. Too often, television tends to think that everything needs to be resolved by the end of the episode. Star Trek itself is kind of bad about this, but it's not unique to Star Trek. Many shows do this. This is the kind of character thread that sticks with you. Sheridan is so obsessed that it just kind of going away after an hour of TV just doesn't make sense to me. It should stick there. He is basically forced down by the Vorlons and by Delenn. And that makes sense. Something that he acknowledges is bigger than himself finally forces himself to think, okay, what's more important? Other people than me? I choose other people. He backs down. But he still shows that he's willing to back away, thereby showing him in opposite of the Ministry of Peace. Now we're going to do something we haven't done in a while. I know you've been waiting for it. Let's go ahead and bring down the spoiler warning. Ba-boom! Spoilers! All the spoilers. Wait, you don't like my sound effect? Spoiler alert. I'm going to continue my thread immediately because this is directly tied to what I was just talking about. This episode, in my opinion, makes the later episodes when Sheridan is fighting against the Clark administration so much more powerful. Because one of the big points and one of the great political realities of those episodes is how careful and tight of a line Sheridan and the Army of Light and the resistance forces have to ride in order to oppose Clark's forces, because they needed to be the good guys, and it would be very, very, very easy for them to be the bad guys in that. So they did everything legally. They legally pursued a method by which that they could be on the side of law and the side of right, while still opposing the people who were in charge of the law. And that is a very, very fine tightrope to walk, but I think that wouldn't have been nearly as important if not for this episode where Sheridan completely threw the law out the window. Note that Garibaldi gave him an alternative. Garibaldi flat out was like, look, I'm with you, but we got to do this by the law. In this room, I'm head of security. And Garibaldi said, why don't you let me tail him? We'll try and get him on something, then we can charge him, do this properly. And that's the difference right there. So later on, Sheridan would do it properly, would do it legally, while still maintaining his rebellion. Make sense? So he learned, is what I'm trying to say. The other thing I want to talk about is Morden and Veer. Let me just go ahead and say Veer is awesome as always. Mr. Morden is awesome as always. You'll notice I didn't even mention this in the rumination without the spoiler section, and that's very, very much on purpose, because holy hell, this is still one of my favorite little moments as far as just amusement factor. Obviously, if you go for severe and seriousness, there's other better moments. But I want to put your head on a pike so that the next 10 generations can know that some favors come at too high a price. I want to look up and wave at your lifeless little eyes like this. Can you and your associates arrange that for me, Mr. Morton? I love that. And on the off chance you're watching this and you don't know or care about spoilers, much later on in the show, Mr. Morton's head is put on a pike and Veer looks up at it and waves at it just like that. I love it. That's all I got, guys. I'm gonna go and chop this off. See you next time.